Some of you might remember that last spring, I had what I thought was diesel runaway. I wasn't exactly sure what had happened, and there was only some lingering problems. All in all, it still ran, and I was thankful that it turned off whenever I turned off the key. Now that it's been 4 or 5 months and I've had some time to think about it and take a look at the Jeep, I wanted to share some of my findings with those of you that were curious as to what exactly happened when I was at Moab. The first thing we're gonna do today is we're gonna talk about diesel runaway because it's really important to today's video. And I realized in the last one where I talked about runaway, there's a lot of people that don't know what that is or even heard that term. So with a 4-stroke direct injected diesel, which is what this model is, which is what our TDI is, the intake stroke happens. The piston moves down, the intake valve opens, it draws air into the cylinder. At the bottom of the intake stroke, that valve closes and we have like a sealed column of air that we're ready to blow stuff up in and make power. It's pretty cool. Compression stroke happens. It starts to compress that column of air, and at a predetermined point, the injector now sprays diesel fuel into this air, making an air-fuel mixture. All those atomized particles are all bumping around. Things are getting, there's a lot of pressure happening. There's already heat in there, and then at some point, it ignites. And so once it ignites, it forces the piston back down, and this creates our power stroke. So by the end of our power stroke, we're hoping we burned all of our fuel, and then at our exhaust stroke, the exhaust valve opens and it pushes all of our spent exhaust gases and everything out of the engine. Super simple. So when people say diesel runaway, what they're talking about is this process is happening pretty much out of control and it just revs to the moon. And a lot of times you'll either float the valves to where this process is happening so fast and the valve springs can't keep up that these valves will just end up hanging open and then the piston will crash into them. And what causes that is a couple different things, either a mechanical malfunction in the injection pump or a mechanical malfunction that causes a whole bunch of extra oil to go into the intake, because diesels burn oil really well. Diesel fuel in itself is essentially an oil. And just used motor oil, which is what the oil vapor usually is as your initial ignition source in a runaway scenario, it's the intake stroke is pulling in a bunch of extra oil particles, and then you have more fuel than you would normally have in the compression stroke. And for whatever reason, this causes the engine to start to rev out. And in a mechanically injected diesel, just turning off the key usually won't do it. Like, do it meaning stop the engine. It's pretty crazy. With a modern direct injected diesel like what I have, each one of these injectors is electronically controlled. So turning off the key should, in theory, get it to turn off, because usually there's not enough oil to keep the runaway scenario happening. But whenever you have a mechanically injected diesel and it starts to rev to the moon, the injection pump's just doing its best to keep up, and there's no electronic input to tell it to stop. What's crazy is that when you turn it off and it kills the fuel source, a lot of times it'll still suck through the shutoff solenoid. It's pretty crazy. And the only times that I've seen, not in person, but I've seen videos of people stopping diesel runaway. And it's usually they have to do it on the intake side. So they'll like rip off the intake, they'll take like a 2x6 or something, and they'll try to put it flat over the turbo, and they'll just push it super hard, hoping to stop the air intake enough to be able to get the engine to calm down. But unfortunately, a lot of times with a runaway scenario, this process is happening so fast that you'll float the valves and you can hit them with the piston, which will destroy the valves. Or it'll rev to the moon and it'll throw a rod out of the block. So it's not a good scenario to be in. I thought that I just got really lucky that it's electronically controlled injectors and I was able to turn it off. But now what I think happened is I think I had a malfunction in my accelerator pedal. And before we get to that, I want to talk about today's sponsor. Injector health is one of the most important things you can consider when owning a diesel-powered vehicle, and Techron makes a great product called Diesel Fuel System Cleaner. As the name implies, this cleans your fuel system, including your injectors, keeping your rig running as it should from the factory. The problem is small particles will collect over time in your injectors, ruin your spray pattern, or even make them stick open, which, believe it or not, can ruin your engine. You guys have heard me say this before, and I mean it. This is the easiest maintenance I do on any of my off-road rigs. And it's just an absolute no-brainer. So let's pop the hood and let's start talking about this throttle pedal. The last time I scanned this thing for codes was like, I don't know, maybe a year and a half ago. It's been a long time because I just don't really have any issues with the engine, so there's no reason to scan it to check the codes. But one of the codes that I found, well, I should say the only code that I found, was a throttle pedal related code. I didn't think anything of it. I just thought maybe it's just a blip, just some sort of weird electrical blip. And so I deleted it and just went about my way. But the couple of months before we had this situation in Moab, it was starting to drive funky. And it's like it was a throttle related drivability thing where it's like sometimes you put it all the way to the floor and it just didn't feel the same. And then other times you give it partial throttle and it was like the most, it was like giving it full throttle. And I was like, huh, this is weird. But it wasn't often enough for me to take it serious. And I was so busy that I just didn't take the time to look into it. Anyway, the throttle pedal is the one thing that controls RPM, right? So whenever we are, when I'm on that obstacle and it starts to just rev like crazy, I mashed it to the floor at the beginning of the obstacle to start to go up, but when I let out, it just continued to rev and just bounce off rev limiter and everything. So I thought that it was it's funny, hindsight's 2020. It's so obvious now that this is a throttle pedal related problem, but at the time, everything pointed to diesel Runaway. So when I killed it, it turned it off just fine because there wasn't like another fuel source or anything like that. And whenever I got back home, I was driving it around and it was the weirdest it's ever been. I'd give it partial throttle. It would hit like 30 pounds of boost, which is only supposed to hit like 21. And then whenever I give it full throttle, it would have like 3 pounds of boost. There's a freaking fly in here. Keep getting my shot, fly. But anyway, so I think that, so I bought a new pedal, I put it in, and it drives outstanding. And then I took it to my friend Josh, we were talking about it because it still does not run right. When it's warm, it runs beautifully, but when it's cold, it does not run right. And I have a feeling it's an injector-related issue. He thought the same thing, and I just told him, man, I have no time to work on this thing. He's a Volkswagen mechanic. I was like, dude, you can just take it for a few months, and whenever you get to it, you can get to it. Here's a brand new camshaft that I've had for 3 years and I haven't put in, and a set of head studs. Just open it up to install the cam, and maybe we'll see something wrong with like a rocker or the valve lash, like the lash on the injector or something is bad. I don't know. So anyway, I just didn't have time to mess with it. He messed with it. He put the new cam in and the studs in. It's the same, but it drives a million times better. The new camshaft really woke this thing up. It is so much better to drive, and the EGTs are lower. It is just outstanding. But I have the same problem where when I fire it up and it cold start it, it's like there's an injector that it's not running the way it should. Like it just didn't like being revved that high or something. It's interesting. I've never seen a situation like this where you bounce off rev limiter for a couple seconds in a diesel, and then all of a sudden it cold starts bad. So I need to do a compression test and make sure that there's not something else going on. But for right now, I'm just gonna use it. You guys have been wanting to see rock crawler content. I've been wanting to see rock crawler content. Once it's warm, it drives outstanding. So I'll just fire it up, let it burp and fart on the trailer, and then I'll pull it off and I'll go and enjoy the day. I think it's safe to say that we have more questions than answers at this point. But I wanted to give you guys an update because I get questions about this Jeep all the time. I'm excited to go out and start using it again, but we do need to address this problem eventually. And for those of you that are watching that are maybe a diesel mechanic or a diesel specialist of some kind, I'm curious what your thoughts are as to what happened. I don't think we had a runaway diesel scenario, but I do think we had an overspeed diesel scenario. And I'm curious if something like that could damage an injector because we're clearly not burning all the fuel at idle. But I wonder if it could just be something as simple as I damaged a piston from overspeed, or I had a little bit of contact between the pistons and the valves. So if you're a specialist, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And heck, even if you're not a specialist, feel free to comment. I'm curious what your speculation is as to what is wrong with this engine and how I should address it moving forward. I don't want to pull it, but if we have to pull it and pull the head off and everything in order to give it a full inspection, then that's just the route we're going to have to go. Until then, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I can't wait to get some more rock crawling content with this Jeep on the channel.